Hello, everyone. I know it's been a big and intense day, and I have to say we have a little bit of an intense panel for you. But before we get going, I think Bill would like to ask you a question. We all have some curiosity, and I just want to sort of put a little bit of an envelope around this question, which is we're going to ask you a question that is not exactly politically correct. We want your honest answer. We're not going to hold you to it. You're all out in the audience. We can't see your face, but we want to see your hands.
Yeah. This will help the panel orient a little bit. So, thinking from your heart, how many of you believe that the voluntary carbon market has fundamentally failed and should be scrapped and redesigned knowing what we know now?
That's this room.
Okay. Now, those of you who did not raise your hand, how many think there's a real value in what we've learned from the carbon market, and at least some of the infrastructure and relationships that we could then build biodiversity credits successfully off of it?
Okay, so that was a pretty
definitive.
grim assessment. So this panel arrives, and I think the background to this conference, and if you talk to Amy and other people, is we're in a pretty tough time. We haven't talked about that a lot on the stage, but we're going to dig in here a little bit at the moment we are, especially we're talking about finance. I want you even to compare where we are using specific examples. You all come from different parts, scientific, policy, finance. What does today look like versus even a year ago in terms of how money is flowing and how optimistic you feel about what's going on? And why don't we start? Why don't you start, Alex?
Sure. So I'm going to briefly start us off with the state of the climate. 2024 was the hottest year on record, and 2025 is off to a very hot start, as I think a lot of people who were coming from the East Coast can attest. Last year was the first year that we passed 1.5 degrees C, and this is in the annual average, so not the long-term average. And a lot of people were really freaked out, and rightfully so. But I want to take a moment to think about these thresholds that we've chosen, so 1.5 and 2 degrees C, and talk about how they're somewhat arbitrary, right? These are just made-up numbers that we've picked. And I think when we think about it as a step function, 1.5, oh, we passed 1.5, now we're off to 2 degrees C, that's our next goal. It gives us this artificial leeway and lots of room to play around instead of actually acting on these incremental goals, these infinite incremental goals that exist between those thresholds.
Okay, so we have passed these thresholds. That's where we stand, and that's sort of grim, but we shouldn't just forget the incremental stuff. Talk to me about the finance world. How's this year been?
It's been a really tough year. I've been doing this for about 25 years, so I've seen kind of clean tech 1.0, 2.0, and now here we are at 3.0. I think we had all hoped we'd be a lot further along. In some ways, we have gotten incredibly far. But I think as far as sentiment is concerned, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, as we all know, investing is a very emotional thing. And this level of uncertainty is unprecedented. So I think everyone thought Trump was usher in a more liquid market. We'd get exits out of the private market. People would be reinvesting. At least we'd get that positive outcome from him. And we've actually gotten the opposite. And so I think what I'm seeing in investment committees, whether it's venture funds, private equity funds, big institutional investors, family offices, foundations, is there's just everyone's trying to sort through noise from signal. And investing is all about conviction. And it's impossible, unless you are so deep in an area and you have such long-term oriented capital, to get to conviction right now. So one of the things I'm doing on behalf of Builders Vision, Lucas Walton right now with a couple partners, is to go out and do what we're calling the Climate Capital Reset Project, and go out and talk to experts across the capital stack, across the supply value chains, and basically say, okay, where within by sector and by geography, where are the gaps that are going to cause stranded assets in those sectors and in those markets, and how can we bolster them using blended capital where needed and supply value chain to prevent those things. But it's a process. I think the next 6 to 12 months is trying to help people build partnerships to gather wisdom and insight, to understand gaps, risks, and where to be able to take advantage of dislocations where we can.
I think, uncertainty is one of the really powerful words you use there. And I work at Bloomberg, and we hear uncertainty in all aspects of the market, really, whether you're talking about the job market or stock market, people hiring. It's just very hard to do it in an era of chaos. Would you like to, Monica, would you sort of like to just sort of...
Let me jump in with a policy perspective. I was appointed by President Biden to be the first envoy for biodiversity and water resources. And I spent a lot of time worrying about what's that nature goal? You know, everybody, I think, in this room is familiar with 1.5 degrees. I'm not sure everyone is familiar with 30 by 30. I hope so, because this is about nature. And just solving the climate crisis doesn't necessarily solve the nature crisis, but solving the nature crisis can very much help solve the climate crisis. And let me just put this in perspective. We are trying to hit 30% of the planet protected or conserved by 2030. That's the global goal. Every country in the world agreed to that in Montreal 2 years ago. And we are nowhere close. We are at 17% on land and 8% in the ocean. And at the same time, we know that more than half of global GDP, or $44 trillion of our economies globally, are dependent on nature. And there is a $700 billion annual gap in nature finance. And at the same time, back to climate, the place where we've started to try to right this imbalance in investment is in the carbon offsets market for trees. And we, as your hands indicated, we don't have faith in that market at all. At a moment when finally the climate agreement has come up with a set of rules and standards by which we could actually really develop it. So I worry that we'll never get a nature market off the ground if we can't get the climate offsets market on one value in nature off the ground.
So David, is Trump really it? I mean, why does this year feel so much grimmer than last year?
Trump's part of it, certainly, a big part of it, because what happens here doesn't stay in America, it spills out. But it's also, it's been building at the global level, the sort of finance, public finance, especially for nature and climate. There's been some consensus around what's needed. Certainly the gaps are better identified, and it's always far short of what's assessed to be needed on both. I guess what this current moment says to me is that this movement of trying to get more private finance in and relying less on the public sector, which has been out there for quite some time, has just now really hit you straight in the face. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act resources, which were, a significant bump for not just the US, but set a model for other countries, that's fundamentally undermined. I'd say the other moment we're in now is that nature and climate have really come together over the last couple of years. And now, at least in the US, you see, as you were both all saying, you're addressing climate through nature, partly because it's politically more correct. And you're sort of hiding behind the terms climate
that's
and
interesting.
so forth. So
weirdly, it's a weird boost.
It is. It's a weird boost for nature, for attention to nature.
But I want to go back to that original hand of polls, because I do think we need to talk about why people lost faith in these solutions, and we are going to get to good news. I don't want everyone to just tune out and think, oh no, but why, Alex, why did everyone's hands go down? Why did that, or up as the case might be, why are people losing faith?
Well, I can certainly speak to some of those aspects. And if you're wondering why a climate scientist is part of this conversation, you're probably not the only one out there. My introduction to climate finance was relatively recent, and that was through a project working in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because they were looking to engage in the global carbon market. And as part of that, we were trying to look at climate risks that was requested as part of their national adaptation plan, and looking at what are the climate risks to their forests, their forest carbon, their peatlands, and also their agriculture. Because in addition to industrial threats to forest, smallholder forest loss is a big cause of that, and that's because when crops aren't doing well, people need more land. So thinking about how are the communities impacted as well, because they will either be also driving that forest loss or preventing it.
So this is the climate feedback loop. Climate, maybe drought or heat means your crops don't do well. You then have to cut more trees, which just causes...
Exactly. So both the direct threats, whether that's wildfire, drought, flooding, or these indirect threats to the communities around the forest.
Anyone else? I mean, Monica, maybe we should go to you because I know you do feel passionately.
I do.
Why did we see that?
I really worry that that is the case in our community. And if our community feels this way about saving nature and finding a way through this thicket that we're in, this troubled spot that we're in, if our community is against it, how will we ever get the rest of the world? And so this is why I came here to plead with all of you, really honestly, to give it a chance. Because if we can't give it a chance in trees, which are the best carbon capture mechanism out there, I don't know who said that, I think it was your boss.
Yeah, but why? You're telling us what you want. I'm asking you why.
Well, what I can tell you is my own background was in the mortgage-backed securities market. And I watched that fail colossally, despite all our efforts to regulate it well and to be accountable and to find standards. And yet, it still exists. And, it has helped to finance people in homes in America. So I believe that this can work. I just think we have to redouble our efforts to find new ways to be accountable, to make sure that the confidence is there from investors, and to put a value, which I know is a controversial thing when it comes to nature, but if we don't value it, we won't value it. We will lose it. And we can win the climate battle theoretically, but if we lose nature along the way, we have lost.
So, what's your thought? Oh, I'm going to clap for that one too. But
yeah, I don't view this as the community being against it. I view it as this is a moment, I think it's actually a really healthy moment for reevaluating what actually works and what doesn't, particularly when it's under, inordinate amounts of pressure and skepticism. I mean, let's be honest, the carbon market was held to a standard that was greater than any other because it got politicized. And I think we're in a situation now where everything's politicized. Trust is so hard to truly build, and through transparency and integrity and process, I think we've made some real strides, and I think we have a little ways to go. Look at the compliance market. I mean, what is it? 10, 20x the size, 100x the size of the voluntary market. But the voluntary market plays an incredibly important role in terms of experimentation, iteration, and figuring out how we can get the big buyers in at scale on things like biodiversity, which is where we need to go. And I do think the idea of we have to change our language, we have to change our approach, because we have to talk to Main Street. We got too elite, we got too in our ivory towers, just like the Democratic Party, we lost touch. And this is our moment. That's why we're calling our project the Reset Project. It's a really healthy opportunity to really look critically at ourselves, how we got to take our responsibility for how we mismessaged and mismanaged.
Well, so I want to get to the good part, which is what we can do to remessage. But if you had to look back and what was the one thing? I mean, if you had to put your finger on the one thing we did wrong.
With carbon markets?
Yeah.
I think we didn't agree on, I think there was a part of the process of reaching across the aisle, and when we were designing and building these around standards, that we got buy-in mutually on and actually built from that place, as opposed to try to shove it down people's throats and that we knew better. There just wasn't, I don't think we built the stakeholder base that was representative of the population.
And even today, the voluntary carbon market has 4 standards.
Yeah.
They can't even agree on
Right.
that, so it undermines confidence in there being sort of a universal set of principles behind what you should be holding yourself to.
And it's
And is
telling
that a frustration across all the different, I mean, we're just talking about carbon markets, but like you say, we need to be talking about other markets, including biodiversity and protecting nature. Is what's happening there, the lack of standards, the fundamental problem elsewhere? Alex, do you have thoughts? I saw you perk up, or you don't want to, you don't want to weigh in the finance part, just the.
I think there are a lot of issues at a lot of different steps. And that, right, includes having standards, but also governance and oversight, and also, right, uncertainty. Is this a good investment? What are the anthropogenic threats? What are the climate threats? So there are a lot of different points that need to be addressed. So I don't
I just
think
think
it's just a one.
perfect's the enemy of the good. We get in this field, we just overcomplicate things and at our own demise, and it leaves us vulnerable to criticism. And I mean, look at IRA bill. Like, there was so much fat in that bill. I could run through. There's hundreds of companies that should not have gotten funding.
It was all carrots and no sticks, as we used to.
Yeah, I think, again, yeah, I think it is governance, and it is shared values, and it is getting down to then, okay, how do we manage and measure in a way that is reflective?
I think there are opportunities, though, now.
Wait, I want to get to that. I just saw a hand in the back. Did someone have something they want to just throw at our panel, and then we're going to
Yes,
get to
way
the
back.
opportunities? Yes, go on.
My name is Megan. I just want to dig in on this forest carbon market skepticism a little bit, because I'm really trying to understand this, particularly as agriculture is trying to figure out how it can play there. Like, who has the lack of confidence in the forest carbon market? Because I can understand in this room where people know a lot, right? Maybe there were some bad fraudulent projects, things like that. That happens in markets all the time. But even like today, a lot of private companies are signing large carbon deals.
Yep.
So maybe repeat the question since she doesn't have the mic. That it was basically, so who is skeptical on this, especially as the agriculture sector takes a look at the opportunities associated with this.
And do you want to answer that, as long as you translate it, or do you want to answer it?
I'll jump in a little bit here and say there is lack of faith in the people who evaluate the legitimacy of these projects, and we need to change that. I'm not so Pollyannish that I think we should just keep plowing ahead with the mistakes built into the system. But there's also a lack of faith in a lot of the governments where the potential carbon sits, places like the DRC, and I've been there, and it is a challenge, but we need to find ways. And the most interesting thing today,
because remember, you've got to go 100 years out. I think it would be hard to give anyone faith in anything 100 years out. I could be wrong, but
Yeah, not all of them are that long, but yes, they're time bound. Yeah.
so where's the reason for optimism? The reason for thinking that maybe this is a point where we could take our learnings and the urgency of the moment and come out with something better? Who sees that and wants to address that?
I think that one thing that makes me optimistic is the fact that Brazil is the COP this year, and there will be a focus on nature and biodiversity because it is such a biodiverse, rich country, and because biodiverse, rich countries are starting to band together to try to find new ways. So I think we need both carbon offsets markets so that we can get to nature offsets, but I also think we need to think about other potential ways of financing nature. And Brazil has this very interesting proposal called the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. And we've talked about using the power of investments and these large investment funds and pools to do the right things. Brazil's trying to create that potential and get the money directly to the governments that perform. So there's a pay for performance element to it. So I think we need to be creative, we need to find some new solutions, and we still need to continue to work towards this carbon tree offset market, because a standing tree is worth an awful lot, and people just assume, and that every article that's written about this assumes that governments, if they put trees in parks, they're there forever. And let me just say, they are not. And particularly when they're under pressure from our friends in the solar and battery industry to go find critical minerals. DRC would just as soon dig for minerals if we can't pay them for their trees.
Well, there's built-in demand too, and I'm here more in my public sector finance capacity, but on the private side, you have corporations that made a lot of commitments, and in order to meet those commitments, they need offsets. And most of them are not going to be. They've already taken the low-hanging fruit in terms of energy efficiency or switching to renewable energy and so forth, and yet to meet their net zero pathway or transition plans, they're going to continue to demand these products.
I hope so, but I think they get a little bit of a black eye. If they get told they're greenwashing by doing it, then where are we?
Well, somewhere. So I think I think the elephant in the room is like technology is improving, visualization from satellite is improving, the science, these climate science is improving, all these things are better. The elephant in the room is quality project management on the ground, right? It's finding good project developers.
Deal flow.
And who can actually manage and train effectively on the ground and produce like the results and the verification that's there, that then that the supply and demand can meet and you have a healthy marketplace. But to do that, there's a lot of capacity building that needs to be done. You need to really understand these local ecosystems, indigenous, you need to understand the NGOs that are effective. Like this is the art and science of stakeholder building. And that's what we have to, I think, acknowledge and go do better. And we have the ability to do that in a way. Let me finish. One other thing is that the other thing that's really critical here is we cannot make the damn mistake that we made with climate, clean tech 1.0 and 2.0, where it's like, this is not venture investing. 99% of this stuff is, this is infrastructure. This is infratech. This is let's manage expectations in terms of the duration, the risk, the return with a capital stack that sets these things up for success, not failure.
And if we can do that, we get to ag, which is a second place.
And we also have to acknowledge that prevention is the best medicine, and we're not good at that. And it's hard to imagine in a world now that's become so much more divided and multipolar that we could actually create unity around these. But it's like nature is our life support system. It should be the thing that is the most valuable thing for us and our kids. And I just believe that if we can get a little bit better at the storytelling and a little bit better at implementation, this movement can take on a whole new life. Going through what we're going through now is a rebirth into something I think much more effective.
Someone mentioned this. If we're talking about nature instead of climate, can we bring both sides on?
I think absolutely. Yes. Yeah. We've found, there is an appetite for nature and nature-based solutions in Congress. So as long as we don't label it a climate. And that's why, the framing yesterday, all our conversation yesterday about not making everything climate, not putting the climate bumper sticker on everything, when really we're talking about environment and conservation. Really try.
Talk about resilience and survival. I mean, half of our project is going to be spent going out and talking to Houston's commodity traders and energy developers. And we're going to be going in China and India, and we're reaching, fully across the aisle to actually ask, and understand their perspective on this. And people who have made a killing in energy and real estate and hard assets and infrastructure, and really try to broaden the tent. We have to change our language to do that. We have to show up in real, genuine process of inquiry. Otherwise, we're going to be in our little fiefdoms yelling at each other, and it's going to be 1 to 5% of the market, and it's not going to work. So we have to build bridges to somewhere.
And China will get there and do the wrong things in the name of doing the right thing.
And the elephant in the room is also AI, and it's that's taking the air out of the room everywhere.
Yeah.
And so everyone's wondering how that's going to affect everything. And so it's a very hard time to get people's attention. And so we have to take into account all these macro and micro factors, and then figure out where are there paths and bridges to somewhere. And by taking into account all those things, not, hoping.
But optimistically, this infrastructure and infratech, it lends itself pretty readily, more so than some of the other types of investments, even on the carbon markets, to this public-private blended finance model.
Yep.
And if, it's going to take some reform of the way the public sector institutions go about that. I mean, I work with Global Environment Facility on investment funds, Green Climate Fund and others. They're really bad at it. Some, they have examples that have worked, but they really need to reset as well.
Yep.
and learn how and listen. They need to go on a listening tour.
One thing we're hearing, for example, on the carbon markets is why not turn it into a reinsurance, basically, opportunity? So how do you get the big buyers, the big corporates, to essentially use buying, let's call it reinsurance, because the biggest unpriced risk in the world is insurance. It cuts across the aisle. We never know where it's going to hit in the tail. I was actually talking to the insurance panel after, and they actually like this idea where it's we need a rainy day fund that can, because we have no idea, it's a collective risk that we all are going to suffer from if these start hitting with the more frequency that we know they're coming. And how do you use carbon to actually fund and backstop where we can no longer insure? And it inordinately affects, the lower income, more vulnerable populations. And I think that, that could be an interesting way of reinventing it.
Yeah, that's another area for optimism. We heard this morning about climate adaptation and resilience. And resilience is another term you can hide behind.
Yeah, I mean, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan and Goldman, what are they're, in this market where they can't talk about climate anymore, ESG, what are they talking about? They're talking about infrastructure risk and resilience. That's their,
resilience is a big thing. Alex, I did want to get to you because over there I feel like and you've got so much of the science background. What I worry about is you talk so much about, in order to make this work, really knowing the details down on the ground, but that's hard to scale. Is there any upside in like AI and the way science is going in terms of making all of this speed up?
Yeah, AI has allowed us great advances in terms of MRV and post-processing of this data, but I actually want to talk more about what's going on the ground and like cases for optimism. There's a lot of South-South collaboration and learning. You're talking about the new fund that Brazil is creating. And so that's not just going to Brazil, right? That's going to DRC, that's going to ROC in Indonesia. And then even capacity building, like you were talking about, right? We're working with the Ministry for the Environment and Sustainable Development in the DRC. We're working with the University of Kinshasa, researchers on the ground at other organizations, community-based organizations. And so even though we talk about all these threats, whether they're industrial or small scale, there are so many people who are so enthusiastic about, monitoring and preserving and protecting these resources.
I think we should stop there with this idea that everyone does understand and love nature, right or left, south to south or south to north. And so that is, I think, a final reason for optimism. So thank you all to our very knowledgeable and passionate panel. Thanks so much.